Okay, so in this podcast, we're going to talk about the changing roles of Black women in the South before, during, and after emancipation. We're also going to delve into some topics on gender identity, post-emancipation, and in particular, we're going to talk about a myth called the Black Rapist myth and how that formed post-emancipation. So in the years that I've taught this era, many of my students were often very perplexed and confused about why things didn't get much better for African Americans after emancipation. Part of this could be because they thought Lincoln and everyone in the North were all abolitionists, which, as we know and Dr. Kelly has discussed, that was a myth also. But it also could be because many did not realize the amount of control white Southerners strived to keep, even after the Civil War. So, white Southerners are not willing to acquiesce their way of life. They're not willing to give it up just because they lost the Civil War. But what white Southerners do go through is something, a sort of identity crisis, and they needed to assure themselves that both their control and their supremacy was maintained. So let's first talk about the role and lives of Black women in the South before the Civil War starts, which is a topic we have talked about before. You remember the discussion with Dr. Kelly and in the class on the readings and the overall discussions of Harriet Jacobs. Black enslaved women undoubtedly were subjected to sexual exploitations. And if you recall, Harriet Jacobs went through extraordinary measures to assure that she did not have to engage in those sexual relations with her own owner. She was willing to give up her chastity. She was willing to give up her grandmother's respect to engage in an affair with another man in order to avoid all those sexual advances from her master. So although her story is super fascinating, it probably really wasn't that unique. Black enslaved women's resistance was something actually historians have uncovered happened quite often. So to understand what I mean, we have to really think about, what does resistance mean? Does resistance have to mean physical resistance? Or can it just be passive resistance? It really could be either. Historians have actually uncovered that Black females resisted in many ways through sexual abstinence, which could just be simply refusing or avoiding sex, through abortion, and even sometimes went through extreme cases of infanticide in order not to bear the child of their master. So some evidence even exists that some slave women feigned pregnancies or faked pregnancies in order to, receive lighter workloads. One story that I found quite fascinating was a book called Celia, a Slave. And in this story that was written by historian Douglas Linder, a Black female slave named Celia, and this is her picture here that they think, that she engaged in the most extreme forms of resistance, the murder of her master. So in the book, it took place in the 1850s, and it took place in Missouri. And this is where it was located, the county that it was located at. And this is actually where the farm was over here, the Newsom farm. But anyway, the book took place in the 1850s, and Douglas Linder explains that Celia was sold into slavery at the age of 14. Since the Atlantic slave trade was no longer in existence, she was most likely ripped from her family and sold to a new master. At least that's what Linder interprets. On the way home after being sold, her 60-year-old master, Robert Newsom, raped her. This continued for 5 years, and Celia actually bore 3 children from her master. So much like what Harriet Tubman's master wanted to do for Harriet, Celia's master built her a cabin that was near the farm where he could continue to sexually exploit her whenever he really pleased. And again, this occurred for over 5 years on a continual basis. When Celia fell in love with a fellow slave on the farm, he gave her an ultimatum. And in that ultimatum, he said that either, you tell Newsom to stop these sexual advances and this sexual interaction, or he would leave her. So I'm not really sure what was in his psyche, really, because as we all have come to understand in this course, it was really difficult for a slave woman to just say no to a master that sees, and the master, remember, sees the Black female slaves as sexually available. But anyway, one night Newsom came to her cabin, and Celia, she attempted to thwart his advances, but to no avail. She grabbed him, and if I remember correctly, she took a shovel or something like a tool, and she hit him on the head. And she continued to beat him until he died. She realized almost immediately what she had done. She took his body, she dragged it into the fire, and she burned his body all night. I know it's completely disgusting, but you have to imagine what she was going through emotionally. I won't go into all the details in the investigation or the trial itself, as it did in some detail in the book. But I will tell you that she eventually hanged, although she had, really fantastic lawyers that really did their very best to save her. It's a very interesting story, but it's also a very sad story, really. So, in summary, although the sexual exploitation is horrid, Black women did find ways to resist. And we should keep this in mind, that this type of resistance was particularly threatening to the white plantation owners after 1808. And of course, what does 1808 mark in constitutional history? Well, it's what ended the Atlantic slave trade according to the Constitution. It was banned. So at this point, the only means to increase the slave population was by Black females giving birth. And anyway, one thing to also keep in mind is that before emancipation, was that there really was nothing that Black women could legally do about the sexual exploitation. They didn't have any legal means to stop their master from doing this. They were considered property. They lacked any form of citizenship rights. So, so therefore they could not bring any charges against any white person, and certainly not against the person that owned them. Resistance was really the only thing they could do to have some kind of agency, some kind of control, or to do something about, their situation. So I'll save the transition of their roles for the next podcast. I'm going to pause it here.